Broken chains free. Lady Catherine of Dunmere had once believed Sir Tristan de Clare to be the most honorable of men until she saw him standing beside her father's murderer. Now, as he caught her by the waist in a dimly lit corridor, his voice was low, edged with something like regret. "You think I have betrayed you," he murmured. "But tell me, my lady, have you never betrayed someone yourself?" Chapter 1. The Serpent's Kiss. The chill of the stone floor seeped through Lady Catherine of Dunmere's thin slippers, a stark contrast to the flush of anger that still burned in her cheeks. The great hall of Dunmere Castle, once a place of warmth and boisterous laughter, now felt like a tomb, echoing with the ghosts of happier days. 3 months. 3 months since her father, Lord Alaric, had fallen, not in glorious battle, but to the treacherous blade of Baron Elric of Blackwood, a man he had once called friend. And beside Elric, in that moment of horror replayed endlessly in her mind, stood Sir Tristan de Clare. Tristan. The name itself felt like a betrayal on her tongue. He had been her father's most trusted knight, a man who had sworn oaths of fealty, a man Catherine herself had admired. More than admired, if she were to be honest, with the cold, empty space where her heart used to beat. His strength, the way his dark eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed composure, the rare, genuine smile that could light up his otherwise stern face, all of it had drawn her in, weaving a tapestry of forbidden longing that she had fiercely guarded. Now, that tapestry was shredded, stained with the blood of her father and the venom of betrayal. The feast to celebrate the peace brokered between Blackwood and Dunmere was a mockery. Every clink of goblets, every forced smile, every platitude uttered by the assembled lords and ladies grated on her raw nerves. Catherine sat beside her younger brother, Thomas, who, at 15, was now the reluctant Lord of Dunmere. He was a pale imitation of their father, his hand trembling as he raised his cup in a toast, his eyes darting nervously towards Baron Elric, who sat at the high table, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Elric. He was all sharp angles and cruel smiles, his dark hair slicked back from a face that was handsome in a predatory way. He held Dunmere in his grasp now, through a treaty that was nothing more than thinly veiled subjugation. Catherine knew the terms: a crippling tribute, the dismantling of Dunmere's defenses, and a marriage alliance. She shuddered, pushing away the plate of roasted boar that had been placed before her. The thought of being bound to anyone associated with Blackwood, let alone Elric himself, made her stomach churn. She caught sight of Tristan then, standing near the entrance to the hall, his gaze fixed on her. He looked different. Gone was the easy confidence, the quiet strength that had always drawn her to him. He was shadowed, his face etched with lines of weariness, his dark eyes holding a depth of sorrow she couldn't fathom. He wore the colors of Blackwood now, the black boar rampant on a field of crimson, a stark contrast to the silver falcon of Dunmere that had once adorned his surcoat. He started towards her, and Catherine felt a surge of panic. She rose abruptly, knocking over her goblet, the red wine spreading across the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. The hall fell silent, all eyes turning towards her. She ignored them, her gaze locked on Tristan as he approached. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice low, barely audible above the sudden hush. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sir Tristan," she replied, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "Or should I say, Sir Tristan of Blackwood?" The emphasis on the last word was sharp, a pointed barb. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. "I understand your anger, my lady," he said. "Do you?" She challenged, her voice rising. "Do you understand what it is to see your father murdered? To see the man you respected standing beside his killer?" His jaw tightened. "I did not raise my sword against your father, Lady Catherine. I swear it on my honor." "Your honor?" She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "What honor does a traitor possess?" He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "There are things you do not understand. Circumstances? She cut him off. "There are no circumstances that excuse betrayal, Sir Tristan." "None." The silence in the hall was absolute. Even Elric had stopped eating, his eyes narrowed, watching the exchange with a flicker of amusement. Catherine felt the weight of everyone's gaze, the pressure of the situation, the knowledge that her every move was being scrutinized. She was a pawn in this game, a piece to be moved and manipulated. But she would not be broken. She lifted her chin, meeting Tristan's gaze with a cold defiance. "Leave me, Sir Tristan. Your presence here is an insult to my father's memory." He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find some trace of the woman he had once known. Then, with a slow, deliberate bow, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the hall. Catherine remained standing, her body trembling, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. The feast continued around her, the forced gaiety returning, but she was no longer a part of it. She was trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by enemies, with no one to trust. Later, as she lay in her cold, empty bed, staring up at the tapestry depicting the falcon of Dunmere soaring above the clouds, she whispered a prayer to the old gods, a prayer for strength, for guidance, and for vengeance. She would not let her father's death go unpunished. She would find a way to reclaim what was rightfully hers, even if it meant walking through fire. And Sir Tristan de Clare, the knight who had betrayed her, would be the first to feel the heat of her wrath. She did not yet know how. It seemed impossible, but there was always a way. There had to be. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, freezing cold in the chamber. It was the last tear she planned on shedding for a long time. Chapter 2. Shadows of Dunmere. The days that followed the disastrous feast were a blur of hushed conversations, strained silences, and the ever-present weight of Blackwood's dominion. Dunmere Castle, once a vibrant hub of activity, felt like a place under siege, its spirit broken, its people living in fear. Catherine moved through the familiar halls like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged, her authority stripped away by the subtle but pervasive influence of Baron Elric. He was careful. She had to give him that. He didn't openly flaunt his power, preferring instead to weave a web of control through seemingly innocuous requests and suggestions. He appointed his own men to key positions within the castle guard, ostensibly to ensure the safety of Lord Thomas and his sister. He advised Thomas on matters of governance, his words carrying the weight of command. He even had the audacity to suggest alterations to the castle's defenses, claiming they were outdated and vulnerable. Catherine saw through his charade, recognizing the slow, deliberate tightening of his grip on Dunmere. She tried to warn Thomas, to make him see the danger, but her brother was either too naive or too frightened to heed her warnings. He seemed to believe that cooperation would appease Elric, that by submitting to his demands, they could somehow preserve what little remained of their independence. Catherine knew better. She had seen the ruthlessness in Elric's eyes, the cold calculation behind his charming facade. He would not be satisfied until Dunmere was completely under his control, until the falcon of their house was crushed beneath the boar of Blackwood. One evening, as she walked along the castle ramparts, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of Dunmere, she saw him again. Tristan. He was standing near the stables, talking to one of Elric's men, his back to her. She paused, her hand gripping the cold stone of the wall, her heart pounding a painful rhythm against her ribs. She hadn't spoken to him since that night in the great hall, hadn't even allowed herself to think his name. But seeing him there, in the fading light, brought back a flood of conflicting emotions. Anger, yes, but also a lingering sense of sadness. He looked so different from the man she had once known, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. She almost turned away, almost convinced herself that it was better to avoid him, to maintain the wall of ice she had erected around her heart. But something, a flicker of curiosity, a desperate need to understand, drew her closer. She approached him silently, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass that grew between the stones. He didn't hear her until she was almost upon him. He turned, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Sir Tristan," she replied, her voice cool, distant. She kept her distance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if to ward off any unwanted contact. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "How are you, my lady?" he asked. She scoffed. "How am I? My father is dead, my brother is a puppet, and my home is occupied by the man who murdered him. How do you think I am, Sir Tristan?" He flinched, but he didn't look away. "I understand your bitterness," he said. "Bitterness?" She laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "It is far more than bitterness, Sir Tristan. It is a hatred that burns like a fire in my soul." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said, "and I do not blame you." She studied him, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the arrogance she had seen in Elric's eyes. But there was only weariness, a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from the very depths of his being. "Why are you here, Tristan?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "Why did you come back?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "I had to," he said. "I had to see to make sure you were safe." She frowned. "Safe? From whom? From you?" He shook his head. "From Elric," he said. "He is not what he seems, Lady Catherine. He is far more dangerous than you know." She stared at him, her mind reeling. Was this another deception? Another attempt to manipulate her? Or could he be telling the truth? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were not overheard. "I cannot say much," he said. "But I urge you to be careful, my lady. Trust no one, especially not Elric." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had already suspected as much, but to hear it from Tristan, from the man who had once been her father's most trusted knight, made it all the more real, all the more terrifying. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. After everything, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain she couldn't understand. "Because I still care about what happens to you, Catherine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He used her given name, a familiarity that sent a jolt through her. She stepped back, her hand flying to her chest, as if to protect herself from the sudden rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't say that." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I understand," he said. "I have no right." They stood there in silence for a long moment, the only sound the wind whistling through the battlements. Catherine felt torn, confused, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling beneath the weight of his words, his presence. "I must go," he said, breaking the silence. "But please, my lady, be careful. Watch your back. And trust your instincts." He bowed low, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Catherine remained standing there, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to believe, what to think. But one thing was clear. The shadows of Dunmere were deeper and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And Sir Tristan de Clare, the knight who had betrayed her, was somehow at the center of it all. She felt a strange sense of foreboding, but a new sense of resolve, too. She wouldn't let herself be blind. She went to the chapel that evening, the small, secluded place of worship, a brief reprieve. She kneeled, but the words of prayer would not come. Instead, the image of Tristan's haunted eyes filled her mind. Chapter 3. A Knight's Confession. The following days were marked by a growing unease within Catherine. Tristan's warning echoed in her mind, amplifying her suspicions about Elric and his intentions. She found herself watching the Baron more closely, observing his interactions with Thomas, the subtle ways he exerted his influence, the almost imperceptible smirk that played on his lips whenever he thought he was unobserved. She tried to speak to Thomas again, to warn him about Elric, but her brother remained stubbornly oblivious. He seemed to be under Elric's spell, convinced that the Baron was acting in their best interests. Catherine felt increasingly isolated, trapped within the walls of her own home, surrounded by enemies she couldn't expose. She found herself seeking solace in the castle library, a vast, dusty room filled with ancient tomes and forgotten scrolls. It was a place her father had loved, a sanctuary where he had spent countless hours poring over books and maps. Catherine had always found comfort there, surrounded by the scent of old paper and leather, the silent wisdom of generations past. It was there, one afternoon, that she encountered Tristan again. He was standing by one of the tall, arched windows, gazing out at the courtyard below. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his attention focused on something outside. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach him or retreat. The memory of their last conversation, his warning about Elric, his unexpected confession of caring, still lingered in her mind, creating a confusing mix of anger and something else. She cleared her throat, and he turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice low, guarded. "Sir Tristan," she replied, her voice equally cautious. She walked towards him, stopping a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I did not expect to see you here," he said. "I come here often," she replied. "It was my father's favorite place." He nodded, his gaze softening. "He was a good man, your father," he said. "A wise and just ruler." Catherine felt a pang of grief, a sharp reminder of her loss. "He was," she agreed, her voice trembling slightly. "And he did not deserve to die the way he did." Tristan looked away, his jaw tightening. "No, he did not," he said. He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I regret what happened. More than you know." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But there was only weariness, a deep-seated sorrow that seemed to resonate with her own. "Why did you do it, Tristan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you stand beside Elric?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his strength. Then he opened them and looked at her, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I had no choice," he said. "I was bound by an oath." She frowned. "An oath? To whom?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "To my father," he said. "Years ago, when I was just a boy, my father made a pact with Elric's father. A blood oath, sworn on the lives of their families." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. A blood oath. It was an ancient tradition, a bond that could not be broken, a promise that transcended even death. "What was the nature of this oath?" she asked. "My father owed Elric's father a debt," Tristan explained. "A debt of honor, incurred during a battle. He swore that he, or his heir, would repay that debt, whatever the cost." "And you are his heir," Catherine said, understanding dawning in her eyes. He nodded. "I was summoned to Blackwood shortly before your father's death," he said. "Elric revealed the existence of the oath, demanded that I fulfill it. By standing beside him as he murdered my father?" Catherine challenged, her voice rising in anger. "I did not know his intentions," Tristan said, his voice pleading. "I swear it. He told me he planned to challenge your father to a duel, to settle their differences honorably. I believed him." Catherine scoffed. "You believed him? Elric? A man known for his treachery and deceit?" "I know," he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. "I was a fool. I should have known better. But I was bound by the oath. I had no choice but to obey." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "I did what I could," he said. "I tried to reason with him, to persuade him to find another way. But he was determined. And when I saw him strike your father down, I was horrified. Sickened." Catherine felt a flicker of something. Pity? Understanding? She wasn't sure. She still couldn't forgive him, couldn't forget the image of him standing beside Elric, his sword stained with her father's blood. But she could see the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse that seemed to consume him. "What now?" she asked, her voice softer now, less accusing. "What happens now?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the courtyard below. "I do not know," he said. "I am trapped, Catherine. Bound by an oath I despise, forced to serve a man I loathe. I am a prisoner in my own life." His words resonated with her own feelings of confinement, of being trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She felt a sudden, unexpected surge of empathy for him, a recognition of their shared plight. "There must be a way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. A way to break free. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Perhaps, he said, but it would be dangerous. For both of us. He reached out and touched her arm, a fleeting contact, quickly retracted. Meet me tonight, he whispered. The old chapel, midnight. There are things I can show you. Things that will prove what I am saying about Elric is the truth. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Doubt, fear, yes, but also a hesitant flicker of hope. Against her better judgment, she agreed. Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty. The hours leading up to midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Catherine found herself pacing her chambers, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Tristan's confession had shaken her to her core, casting doubt on everything she thought she knew about him, about Elric, about the circumstances surrounding her father's death. Could she trust him? He had betrayed her once, stood beside her father's murderer. But his words, his eyes, the palpable anguish he carried, they hinted at a deeper truth, a hidden struggle that resonated with her own. She remembered his touch, brief as it had been, and how it had sparked a shiver not entirely of fear. She glanced at the small, ornate clock on her mantelpiece. It was almost time. She had managed to slip away from the watchful eyes of Elric's guards, claiming a need for solitude and prayer. She knew the risks were immense. If she were caught meeting with Tristan, it would be seen as treason, punishable by she didn't even want to think about it. But the thought of uncovering the truth, of finding a way to avenge her father's death and reclaim her home, spurred her on. She wrapped herself in a dark cloak, its hood concealing her features, and slipped out of her chambers, moving silently through the darkened corridors of the castle. The old chapel was located in a secluded part of the castle, far from the main living quarters. It had been abandoned years ago, its once grand interior now crumbling and neglected. The air inside was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. Tristan was already there, waiting for her in the shadows near the altar. He was dressed in simple, dark clothing, his sword at his side. He looked up as she entered, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. "You came," he said, his voice low, relief evident in his tone. "I did," she replied, her voice equally hushed. She approached him, her heart pounding in her chest. "You said you had something to show me." He nodded. "Come," he said, leading her towards a small, wooden door concealed behind the altar. He pushed it open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that descended into darkness. "Where does this lead?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "To the old crypts," he replied. "Beneath the castle." Catherine hesitated. The crypts were where the former lords and ladies of Dunmere were buried, a place of darkness and death. She had always avoided them, even as a child. "Why are we going there?" she asked. "Because that is where Elric keeps his secrets," Tristan said. "The things he doesn't want anyone to see." He took the candle and started down the stairs, beckoning her to follow. Catherine took a deep breath and followed him, her hand gripping the cold, damp stone of the wall. The crypts were even more oppressive than she had imagined. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the rustle of unseen creatures. The tombs of her ancestors lined the walls, their stone effigies staring blankly into the darkness. Tristan led her through a maze of narrow passageways, his candle casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. She felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling of fear at the back of her neck. Finally, he stopped before a large, iron-bound door. He set the candle down on a nearby ledge and pulled out a heavy key. "This is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The entrance to Elric's private chamber." He inserted the key into the lock and turned it, the mechanism groaning in protest. The door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Catherine gasped. The room was filled with objects that seemed out of place in a crypt, maps, documents, weapons, and a chest. A large, ornate chest, bound in iron and secured with a heavy padlock. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice hushed with awe and apprehension. "Evidence," Tristan said. "Evidence of Elric's treachery." His plans. His alliances.
He pointed to the maps.
He has been plotting with other lords, conspiring to overthrow the king, he said. He plans to seize Dunmere, not just as a prize of conquest, but as a strategic stronghold. He gestured towards the documents. These are letters, intercepted correspondence between Elric and his allies, he said. They detail his plans, his betrayals, his ambitions. Catherine stepped closer, her eyes scanning the documents. She recognized the seals of several prominent noble families, families that had sworn fealty to the king. Her blood ran cold. And the chest? She asked, her gaze fixed on the large, locked box. Tristan hesitated. I do not know, he said. I have not been able to open it. But I suspect it contains something significant. Something Elric is desperate to keep hidden. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We need to get this evidence to the king, he said. We need to expose Elric before it is too late. Catherine nodded, her mind racing. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she also knew that she couldn't stand by and watch Elric destroy everything her family had built.
How? She asked.
How do we get it out of here? Elric's men are everywhere. Tristan thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration.
There is a secret passage, he said.
It leads from the crypts to the outside, beyond the castle walls. It is known only to a few. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. But it is dangerous, he said. And I will need your help. A flicker of something excitement, perhaps, or even hope ignited within her. She met his gaze, her own determination hardening. I will help you, she said, her voice firm. Whatever it takes. As she spoke, a scraping noise came from the doorway, as if someone had moved outside. Both of them froze and looked toward the door, now closed. Had they been followed? Chapter 5. Whispers in the Cloisters. The sound, faint as it was, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Catherine. She and Tristan exchanged a look of alarm, their shared fear palpable in the confined space of Elric's hidden chamber. Tristan quickly moved to the door, pressing his ear against the heavy wood, listening intently. Catherine held her breath, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of her own heart. After a moment, Tristan slowly shook his head. I hear nothing, he whispered, his voice laced with uncertainty. But we cannot be sure. Someone could have been there and gone to alert Elric. The thought sent a chill down Catherine's spine. If they were discovered, the consequences would be dire. Not only would their plan to expose Elric be thwarted, but they would also face his wrath, which she knew could be both swift and brutal. We need to move quickly, she whispered, her mind racing. The secret passage, can you lead me to it? Tristan nodded. Yes, but we must be careful. If we are seen, he didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. He picked up the candle, its flame flickering precariously, casting dancing shadows on the walls. We'll take the chest, Catherine said, her gaze fixed on the heavy, locked box. It's the most important piece of evidence. Tristan hesitated. It will be difficult to carry, he said, and it will slow us down. We have no choice, Catherine insisted. We can't leave it here. Whatever secrets it holds, Elric clearly wants them kept hidden. That means they're valuable to us. Tristan nodded, his jaw set with determination. He knelt beside the chest and tried to lift it, his muscles straining with the effort. It was clearly heavier than it looked. Help me, he said, his voice grunting with exertion. Catherine knelt beside him, and together, they managed to lift the chest, its weight a heavy burden between them. They carried it to the door, their movements slow and awkward. Tristan opened the door cautiously, peering out into the dimly lit passageway. He listened for a moment, then motioned for Catherine to follow him. They moved as silently as possible through the maze of crypts, the only sound the soft thud of their footsteps and the occasional scrape of the chest against the stone walls. Catherine felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. They reached the end of a long, narrow passageway, where Tristan stopped before a seemingly solid wall. He set the candle down on a nearby ledge and placed his hands against the stone, feeling for something. "Here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He pressed against a particular stone, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow opening.
"This is it," he said.
The entrance to the secret passage. He picked up the candle and stepped through the opening, beckoning Catherine to follow. She followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. The passage was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of earth and decay was even stronger than in the crypts. They moved slowly, carefully, the chest a heavy burden between them. Catherine felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being trapped in this dark, confined space. They had been walking for what seemed like an eternity when they heard a noise behind them. A faint scraping sound, followed by the muffled sound of voices. They froze, their blood turning to ice. They were being followed. "We need to hurry," Tristan whispered, his voice urgent. "They know we are here." They picked up the pace, their movements becoming more frantic. The passage twisted and turned, seemingly without end. Catherine felt her strength fading, her arms aching from the weight of the chest. Suddenly, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. In the center of the chamber was a well, its dark, gaping maw promising an unknown depth. "Where are we?" Catherine asked, her voice breathless. "This is the old well chamber," Tristan replied. "The passage continues on the other side." He pointed to a narrow ledge that ran along the edge of the well, leading to another opening on the opposite side. "We have to cross that," he said. "It's the only way." Catherine looked at the ledge, her heart sinking. It was narrow, barely a foot wide, and the drop into the well was terrifying. I don't know if I can," she said, her voice trembling. Tristan looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know it's frightening," he said. "But we have no choice. We have to do this." He took a deep breath and started across the ledge, his movements slow and deliberate. Catherine watched him, her heart in her throat. He reached the other side safely and turned to face her, his hand outstretched.
"Come," he said.
"I'll help you." Catherine took a deep breath and stepped onto the ledge. She kept her eyes fixed on Tristan, her hand gripping his tightly. She moved slowly, carefully, her every step measured. She was halfway across when she heard a shout behind them. She looked back and saw several of Elric's men entering the chamber, their swords drawn. "Hurry," Tristan urged, his voice filled with urgency. Catherine quickened her pace, her fear driving her on. She reached the other side and stumbled into Tristan's arms, her body trembling. They didn't have time to rest. They could hear the men approaching, their footsteps echoing in the chamber. Tristan pulled Catherine through the opening on the other side, and they found themselves in another narrow passage. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the darkness, the shouts of their pursuers growing closer. The passage led them to a wooden door, barred from the inside. Tristan quickly unbarred the door and pushed it open, revealing the night sky. They were outside, beyond the castle walls. They had made it, but they were not safe yet. They could still be seen, still be caught. A sudden sense of determination washed the terror away. They needed a plan, and fast. Chapter 6. The Falcon's Flight. The cold night air hit Catherine's face like a slap, momentarily shocking her back to awareness after the stifling confines of the secret passage. They were in a small, overgrown courtyard, tucked away behind the castle stables. The moon, a sliver hidden behind scudding clouds, offered little illumination, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with menace. "Where do we go?" Catherine whispered, her breath misting in the cold air. She was still clutching Tristan's arm, her grip tight, as if she feared he might vanish into the darkness. Tristan scanned their surroundings, his eyes narrowed, alert. "The forest," he said, pointing towards a dense thicket of trees a short distance away. "It's our best chance of escaping unseen." He started towards the trees, pulling Catherine along with him. They still had the chest, its weight a constant reminder of the danger they were in. "We can't carry this much further," Catherine said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's too heavy." Tristan stopped, his chest heaving. He knew she was right. The chest was slowing them down, making them vulnerable.
"We'll hide it," he said. "For now.
We can come back for it later, when it's safer." He looked around, searching for a suitable hiding place. His gaze fell upon a large, hollow oak tree near the edge of the forest. "There," he said, pointing towards a tree. "It's our best option." They carried the chest to the tree and, with some effort, managed to wedge it into the hollow trunk. They covered it with leaves and branches, concealing it as best they could. "Remember this spot," Tristan said, his voice urgent. "We must not forget it." Catherine nodded, her mind imprinting the image of the tree, its gnarled branches reaching up towards the sky like skeletal fingers. They continued into the forest, moving as quickly and silently as possible. The trees were dense, their branches intertwined, blocking out most of the moonlight. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and twigs, making it difficult to walk without making noise. Catherine felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. She could hear the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the hooting of an owl, the snapping of twigs. Every sound made her jump, her nerves on edge. "How far do we go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to reach the old hunting lodge," Tristan replied. "It's about a league from here, deep in the forest. It's abandoned, but it will provide us with shelter." A league. It seemed like an impossible distance, especially in their current state, exhausted and pursued. But Catherine knew they had no choice. They had to keep moving, had to reach safety. They walked for what seemed like hours, their bodies aching, their feet sore. Catherine felt her strength fading, her legs heavy, her steps faltering. Suddenly, Tristan stopped, his hand raised in a warning gesture. He listened intently, his head cocked to one side. "I hear something," he whispered. "Ahead of us." Catherine strained her ears, trying to hear what he heard. At first, she heard nothing but the rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. But then she heard it too. A faint sound, like the snapping of a twig, followed by the muffled sound of voices. They were being followed. Again. "We need to hide," Tristan said, his voice urgent. "Quickly." He pulled Catherine off the path and into the dense undergrowth, concealing them behind a thick cluster of bushes. They crouched low, their bodies pressed against the cold, damp earth. They could hear the voices getting closer, the sound of footsteps approaching. Catherine held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The voices passed by, their owners unseen in the darkness. Catherine and Tristan remained hidden, their bodies tense, their ears straining. After a moment, the voices faded away, and the sounds of the forest returned to normal. Tristan slowly rose, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. "They're gone," he said, his voice relieved. "For now. But we cannot stay here. We need to keep moving." They continued their journey, their pace quickened by the near encounter. Catherine felt a renewed sense of determination, a fierce resolve to survive. She would not be captured. She would not let Elric win. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pale pink and gray, they finally reached the old hunting lodge. It was a small, dilapidated structure, its wooden walls weathered and cracked, its roof sagging. But it was shelter, a place to rest, a place to plan their next move. They entered the lodge cautiously, their senses alert. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with cobwebs and the scent of decay. But it was dry, and it offered some protection from the elements. Tristan collapsed onto a rickety wooden bench, his body exhausted. Catherine sat beside him, her own strength spent. They were safe for the moment, but they knew their journey was far from over. The hunt was still very much on. They needed a plan and allies. Someone, anyone, powerful enough to believe them, and to help. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the hunting lodge's walls, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and revealing the full extent of their refuge's disrepair. Catherine shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her. Exhaustion clung to her like the damp chill of the forest floor, but beneath it, a knot of anxiety tightened. They were safe for now, but now was a fleeting thing. Tristan sat slumped on the bench, his head in his hands. His dark hair, usually neatly combed, was disheveled, streaked with dirt and leaves. The lines of weariness etched around his eyes seemed deeper than before, his face pale and drawn. Catherine watched him, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. She still felt the sting of his perceived betrayal. The image of him standing beside Elric seared into her memory. But she had also seen his pain, his remorse, his desperate attempt to help her. She had seen the fear in his eyes when they were pursued, and the determination when he spoke of exposing Elric. She reached out and touched his arm, a tentative gesture. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Tristan," she said softly, "are you all right?" He managed a weak smile.
"Just tired," he said.
"And worried." "Me too," she admitted. "What do we do now?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We need to get that evidence to the king," he said. "But it's a long journey. And dangerous. Elric will have men searching for us everywhere. We can't go back to Dunmere," Catherine said, a shudder running through her. "Not yet. Not until we have proof of Elric's treachery." "No," Tristan agreed. "We can't. But we need allies. Someone powerful enough to challenge Elric, someone who will believe us." Catherine thought for a moment, her mind sifting through the names of the noble families she knew. Most were either allied with Elric or too weak to oppose him. "There's Lord Arion," she said, a flicker of hope igniting within her. "Of Silverwood. He was a close friend of my father's. He's honorable, and he has a strong army." Tristan nodded slowly.
"Silverwood," he said.
"It's a possibility. But it's a long way from here, across open country. We'd be exposed, vulnerable." "It's our best chance," Catherine insisted. "Lord Arion is the only one I can think of who might be willing to help us." Tristan hesitated, then nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll head for Silverwood. But we need to be careful. We need to travel by night, avoid the main roads, stay hidden as much as possible." They spent the rest of the day resting, trying to regain some of their strength. Catherine found some scraps of food in a cupboard, dried meat and hard bread, barely enough to satisfy their hunger. They shared what little they had, their silence punctuated by the creaking of the old lodge and the rustling of leaves outside. As they ate, Catherine studied Tristan, her gaze drawn to a long, thin scar that ran along his jawline, partially hidden by a stubble. She had never noticed it before. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, her voice curious. Tristan touched the scar, his fingers tracing its outline. He hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. "It was a long time ago," he said. "During a battle. I was just a squire then, barely old enough to wield a sword." "Tell me," Catherine said, her voice gentle. He sighed, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking back into the past. "We were fighting against a band of raiders," he said. "They were brutal, merciless. They attacked a village, slaughtered innocent people, burned their homes." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I saw one of them attacking a young woman," he continued. "She was no older than you."
"Y intervened."
"I fought him, tried to protect her." He touched the scar again. "He was a skilled warrior, much stronger than me," he said. "He almost killed me. But I managed to wound him, drive him off." "You saved her?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with admiration. He nodded. "Yes," he said. "But it cost me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I learned a valuable lesson that day," he said. "Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a price. Sometimes you have to sacrifice everything for what you believe in." His words resonated with Catherine, echoing her own feelings, her own determination to avenge her father's death and reclaim her home. She saw a new depth in Tristan, a strength that went beyond his physical prowess, a moral compass that guided his actions, even when it led him down a dangerous path. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "For telling me, and for everything." He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze holding hers. A spark of connection, of understanding, passed between them. It was a fragile thing, built on shared adversity and a growing sense of trust, but it was there. As night fell, they prepared to leave the lodge. They knew the journey ahead would be perilous, but they were ready. They had a purpose, a goal, and each other. They would face the dangers together, and together, perhaps find a way to make things right once more. A cold, harsh wind had picked up, but it did little to dampen the strange spark of hope now between them. Chapter 8. The Tournament of Treachery. Their journey to Silverwood was fraught with peril. They traveled mostly by night, skirting villages and avoiding main roads, relying on Tristan's knowledge of the land and Catherine's familiarity with hidden paths known only to locals. They slept in snatches, huddled together for warmth in abandoned barns or beneath the sheltering branches of ancient trees. Food was scarce, and they often went hungry, their bodies growing weaker, their spirits tested. Despite the hardships, a fragile bond continued to grow between them. They shared stories of their past, their hopes and fears, their dreams and regrets. Catherine learned more about Tristan's upbringing, his rigorous training as a knight, the weight of his family's expectations. He, in turn, listened with empathy as she spoke of her father, her love for Dunmere, her grief and anger over her loss. One evening, as they were resting near a small stream, Tristan noticed Catherine staring at a group of wildflowers growing nearby. "My mother loved those," she said, her voice soft, wistful. She used to say they were a sign of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, beauty can still be found. Tristan picked one of the flowers and handed it to her. "Then let it be a sign of hope for us," he said, his voice gentle. Catherine took the flower, her fingers brushing against his. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something more, a warmth, a connection that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for anyone since her father's death. As they drew closer to Silverwood, they learned that Lord Arion was hosting a tournament, a grand event that had drawn knights and nobles from across the land. The news was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it meant that Lord Arion would be surrounded by potential allies, making it easier for them to reach him. On the other hand, it also meant that Elric's men might be present, making it more dangerous for them to approach. "We need to be careful," Tristan said. "We can't just walk into Silverwood and demand an audience with Lord Arion. We need a plan." They decided to enter the tournament grounds as spectators, blending in with the crowd, observing the situation, and looking for an opportunity to speak to Lord Arion privately. They knew it was a risk, but it was their best chance. The tournament was a spectacle of color and sound. Banners fluttered in the breeze, trumpets blared, and the crowd roared with excitement as knights in shining armor clashed on the field. Catherine and Tristan, dressed in simple, nondescript clothing, made their way through the throng of people, their eyes scanning the faces, searching for Lord Arion. They found him seated in the royal box, surrounded by his entourage. He was a tall, imposing man, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, his face weathered and lined, but still bearing the marks of a distinguished warrior. Catherine felt a surge of hope. He looked just as she remembered him, strong and honorable. But as they watched, they saw another figure approach Lord Arion, a figure that made Catherine's blood run cold. Elric. He was dressed in fine clothes, his dark hair slicked back, his face wearing that familiar, smug smile. He whispered something to Lord Arion, his hand resting on the older man's arm in a gesture of false camaraderie. Catherine felt a wave of despair. Elric had reached Lord Arion before them. He was poisoning his mind, weaving his web of lies and deceit. "We need to get to him," Catherine said, her voice urgent, "before it's too late." Tristan nodded, his jaw set with determination. But as they tried to move closer, they were stopped by a group of guards, their faces stern, their hands resting on their swords. "You cannot pass," one of the guards said, his voice gruff. "Lord Arion is not to be disturbed." Catherine and Tristan exchanged a look of frustration. They were so close, yet so far. Suddenly, Tristan had an idea. He turned to Catherine, his eyes gleaming. I'll enter the tournament, he said. It's a risk, but it's our only chance. If I can win, I can gain an audience with Lord Arion, a chance to speak to him privately. Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. It was a dangerous plan, reckless even. But she knew it was their best hope. She knew that, realistically, they had little choice. Be careful, she said, her voice filled with concern. Please. He smiled and, turning away, went to register for the lists. She watched, agonizingly, praying he would succeed and survive. She knew if he went down, they were truly lost. As she waited, anxious, she felt a cold dread. Something was wrong. Elric was too calm. This was a trap, she realized too late. Chapter 9. A Dance of Deception. Catherine's premonition proved chillingly accurate. As Tristan, riding under a borrowed banner and nondescript armor, advanced through the early rounds of the tournament, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The cheers for him were muted, replaced by whispers and uneasy glances. Lord Arion, who had initially watched with a neutral expression, now seemed to be studying Tristan with a growing suspicion. Elric, she saw, was never far from Lord Arion's side, his words like a slow-acting poison, dripping into the older lord's ear. She could almost hear the lies he was spinning, the accusations he was making, painting Tristan as a traitor, a murderer, a pawn of Dunmere's enemies. Catherine felt a growing sense of desperation. She had to do something, to warn Tristan, to expose Elric's treachery before it was too late. But she was trapped, surrounded by Elric's men, her every move watched. As Tristan prepared for his next joust, she saw Elric approach him, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He said something to Tristan, his words inaudible to Catherine, but the effect was immediate. Tristan's face paled, his eyes widening in shock and fear. Catherine's heart clenched. What had Elric said? What threat had he made? The joust began, and Catherine watched in horror as Tristan, usually a skilled and confident warrior, seemed to falter. His movements were hesitant, his attacks lacked their usual force. His opponent, a burly knight in black armor, easily unseated him, sending him crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped, and a murmur of disbelief ran through the stands. Tristan lay still, his body sprawled in the dirt. Catherine felt a scream building in her throat, but she forced it down, knowing that any display of emotion would only draw unwanted attention. Elric, she saw, was laughing, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He had won. He had broken Tristan, not just physically but spiritually. Guards rushed onto the field, surrounding Tristan's fallen form. Catherine tried to push her way through the crowd, desperate to reach him, but she was held back, her pleas ignored. She saw Lord Arion rise from his seat, his face grim. He said something to his guards, and they nodded, their hands tightening on their swords. Catherine knew what was coming. They were going to arrest Tristan, to imprison him, perhaps even execute him. She had to act and fast. She scanned the crowd, searching for a way out, a way to reach Tristan, to save him. Suddenly, her eyes fell upon a group of musicians, standing near the edge of the field. They were dressed in colorful costumes, their instruments at the ready. An idea, desperate and reckless, sparked in her mind. She pushed her way through the crowd, reaching the musicians just as they were about to begin playing. She grabbed the leader of the group, a young man with a lute, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice desperate. "Please. You have to help me." The musician looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. What do you want?" he asked. "I need your clothes," Catherine said. "Your instrument. Please. It's a matter of life and death." The musician hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the desperation in her face, the genuine plea for help. He nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll help you, but be careful." He quickly exchanged clothes with Catherine, handing her his lute and his colorful costume. She donned the disguise, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way onto the field, blending in with the other musicians. She approached the guards surrounding Tristan, her lute held loosely in her hands. "Make way," she said, her voice disguised, trying to sound authoritative. "Lord Arian has requested a song to celebrate the victory." The guards hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She knelt beside Tristan, her fingers brushing against his arm. He was alive but unconscious. She began to play the lute, her fingers moving across the strings, producing a slow, mournful melody. She sang, her voice soft but clear, her words a coded message to Tristan, a warning, a plea for him to wake up, to fight. She sang of betrayal, of treachery, of false accusations. She sang of a knight, wrongly accused, imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. She sang of a lady, desperate to save him, to expose the truth. As she sang, she saw Tristan's eyelids flutter. He was regaining consciousness. She continued to sing, her voice growing stronger, her words more urgent. She saw his eyes open, his gaze focusing on her. He recognized her, despite her disguise. She saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a spark of hope. She knew she couldn't keep the pretense going much longer. The real musicians were signaling for her to stop, and Elric was looking at her with dawning suspicion. She ended the song abruptly, a single perfect chord left hanging in the air, and, still playing dead, but ready, Tristan was being moved from the arena. She needed to get to the chest, and fast before it could be discovered. Chapter 10. The Lion and the Lamb. Catherine slipped away from the tournament grounds as quickly and discreetly as she could, the borrowed musician's clothes feeling like a suffocating shroud. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and determination. She had to get to the chest, retrieve the evidence of Elric's treachery, and somehow get it to Lord Arian before Tristan was condemned. She made her way back to the hollow oak tree, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of the tournament. She reached the tree and, with trembling hands, pulled away the branches and leaves concealing the chest. It was still there, untouched. She knelt beside the chest, her fingers fumbling with the heavy padlock. She had no key, no way to open it. Desperation welled up inside her, threatening to overwhelm her. Suddenly, she remembered something Tristan had said, a whispered conversation they had shared during their journey. He had mentioned a hidden compartment in the chest, a secret latch, known only to a few. He had learned of it from his father, who had once dealt with the craftsman who had made the chest. She ran her fingers along the edges of the chest, feeling for any sign of a hidden mechanism. Her fingers brushed against something, a small, almost imperceptible indentation. She pressed it, and a section of the chest's ornate carving slid open, revealing a small keyhole. Hope surged through her. She had found it, but she still needed a key. She looked around frantically, her eyes searching for anything that might serve as a makeshift key. Her gaze fell upon a small, sturdy twig lying nearby. She picked it up, her hands trembling. She inserted the twig into the keyhole, her breath held tight in her chest. She turned it gently, carefully, feeling for the mechanism to engage. It wouldn't work. It was too fragile. Frustration began to mount again. Then she remembered something else. Pinned to the inside of her borrowed tunic was a long, decorative pin made of sturdy metal, used to hold the garment's folds in place. With renewed hope, she pulled it free and tried again. With a click, the lock sprung open. Catherine gasped, her heart leaping with relief. She lifted the lid of the chest, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled among layers of velvet, were scrolls, documents, and a small, leather-bound book. She picked up the book, her fingers tracing its worn cover. She opened it, and her eyes widened in shock. It was a journal, written in Elric's own hand. She began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The journal detailed Elric's plans, his betrayals, his ambitions. It confirmed everything Tristan had told her and more. It revealed Elric's plot to overthrow the king, his alliance with other treacherous lords, his cold-blooded murder of her father. Catherine felt a wave of nausea, a surge of anger so intense that it made her tremble. She had the proof. She had the evidence she needed to expose Elric and clear Tristan's name. But how to get it to Lord Arion? She couldn't simply walk into the castle and demand an audience. Elric's men were everywhere, and she was a wanted fugitive. She needed a plan, a way to reach Lord Arion without being caught. She thought of the tournament, of the crowds, of the guards. And then she remembered something else. Lord Arion had a daughter, Lady Lyra. Catherine had met her once, years ago, at a gathering of noble families. Lyra was known for her kindness, her compassion, her sense of justice. She was also known to be a skilled falconer, often seen with her favorite bird, a magnificent white gerfalcon. An idea sparked in Catherine's mind. A desperate, risky plan, but it was her only hope. She closed the chest, concealing it again within the hollow tree. She took the journal, tucking it inside her borrowed clothes. She then made her way back towards the castle, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Lady Lyra near the falconry mews, preparing her bird for a flight. Catherine approached her cautiously, her hands hidden beneath her cloak. "Lady Lyra," she said, her voice low, urgent. "I need your help." Lyra looked at her, her eyes narrowed with suspicion.
Who are you?
She asked. "And what do you want?" Catherine took a deep breath. "My name is Catherine of Dunmere," she said. "And I have proof that your father is in danger, that he is being deceived by a traitor." Lyra's eyes widened. "Dunmere?"
She said.
"But I know what they say about me," Catherine said. "But it's not true. Elric is the traitor. He murdered my father, and he is plotting to overthrow the king. I have proof." She pulled out the journal, holding it out to Lyra.
"Please," she said.
"Read this. It will explain everything." Lyra hesitated, then took the journal, her fingers trembling. She began to read, her eyes widening with each passing line. Catherine watched her, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Lyra's reaction would determine everything. It was a gamble, perhaps a foolish one, but the only one she could make. Trust the lamb, to reach the lion. Chapter 11. Beneath a Blood Moon. Lady Lyra's face, as she read Elric's journal, transformed from suspicion to shock, then to a chilling, controlled fury. Her hands, usually so gentle with her falcons, clenched into fists, the delicate skin stretched taut over her knuckles. When she finally looked up, her eyes, the same piercing blue as her father's, were filled with a steely resolve that sent a shiver of both relief and apprehension through Catherine. This is monstrous," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "I knew Elric was ambitious, but I never imagined this." Catherine held her breath, waiting for Lyra's judgment, her fate hanging in the balance. "You say this Tristan de Clare is innocent?" Lyra asked, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "He is," Catherine affirmed, her voice strong and clear. "He was bound by an oath, forced to serve Elric. But he never betrayed my father. He tried to stop him. And he has risked everything to help me expose Elric's treachery." Lyra studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Catherine's face, as if trying to discern the truth hidden within. Then she nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said. "My father, he trusts Elric. He has been blinded by his lies. We need to show him this, to make him see the truth."
"But how?"
Catherine asked, her voice filled with urgency. "Elric's men are everywhere. They will not let me near your father." Lyra thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration.
"Tonight," she said.
"There is a council meeting. All the lords will be present, including Elric. My father will be distracted. It is our best chance." "But how do we get in?" Catherine asked. "The castle will be heavily guarded." Lyra smiled, a flicker of cunning in her eyes. "I have a way," she said. "I am my father's daughter, after all. I know this castle like the back of my hand." She led Catherine to a small, secluded garden, hidden behind the castle's main walls. It was a place where Lyra often came to escape the pressures of court life, a sanctuary filled with fragrant herbs and flowers. "There is a secret passage," Lyra explained, pointing towards a seemingly solid wall covered in ivy. "It leads to a hidden chamber, connected to the council room. It is known only to a few. She pushed aside the ivy, revealing a small, wooden door, almost invisible against the stone. She opened it, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that descended into darkness.
"This is it," she said. "Follow me."
And be careful. They descended into the passage, the air growing cold and damp. The darkness was almost complete, broken only by the faint glow of a small lantern Lyra carried. They reached the end of the passage and found themselves in a small, dusty chamber. Lyra pressed against a section of the wall, and a panel slid open, revealing a narrow slit that looked out into the council room. Catherine peered through the slit, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the council table, surrounded by lords and ladies, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. Her gaze immediately went to Lord Arian. He looked weary. Elric was there, standing beside Lord Arian, his hand resting on the older man's arm in that familiar gesture of false camaraderie. Catherine felt a surge of anger, a desperate need to expose him, to make them all see the truth. "Now," Lyra whispered, "give me the journal." Catherine handed her the journal, her hands trembling. Lyra took a deep breath and stepped through the opening into the council room. A hush fell over the room as Lyra entered, her presence unexpected and disruptive. All eyes turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Lyra?" Lord Arian said, his voice questioning. "What is the meaning of this?" Lyra ignored him, her gaze fixed on Elric. She walked towards him, her steps deliberate, her head held high. "Lord Elric," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out in the sudden silence. "I have something to show you. Something that will reveal your true nature, your treachery, your lies." She held up the journal, her hand steady. "This," she said, "is your journal. Your own words, detailing your plans to overthrow the king, your alliance with our enemies, your murder of Lord Alaric of Dunmere." A gasp ran through the room. Elric's face paled, his eyes widening in shock and fear. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Lord Arian rose from his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. "Lyra," he said, his voice trembling. "What is this? What are you saying?" "Read it, Father," Lyra said, her voice unwavering. "Read it and see the truth for yourself." She handed the journal to her father, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. Lord Arian took the journal, his hands trembling. He began to read, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression growing darker with each passing line. Catherine watched from the hidden chamber, her heart pounding in her chest. The fate of Dunmere, of Tristan, of herself, hung in the balance. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rustling of pages and the occasional gasp from one of the assembled lords. Outside, the moon turned a baleful red as clouds passed before it. The turning point was close. Elric, she saw, was trying to regain his composure. With the air of a cornered predator, he was looking at her, deducing that she must be the source of his undoing. He started to move, and Catherine knew he would stop at nothing to silence her, and the truth. Chapter 12. The Edge of the Abyss. As Elric's gaze locked onto the narrow slit where Catherine hid, she felt a chill crawl down her spine. His eyes, usually filled with a calculated coldness, now blazed with a raw, animalistic fury. He knew she was the one who had exposed him, the one who had shattered his carefully constructed web of lies. Catherine saw him start to move, his hand reaching for the sword at his side. She knew she had only seconds to react. If he reached her, if he exposed her hiding place, everything would be lost. "He's lying," Elric roared, his voice echoing through the council chamber. "It's a forgery, a trick. That woman, she's a traitor, a spy from Dunmere." He pointed towards the hidden chamber, his finger trembling with rage. "She's there," he shouted. "Seize her." The guards, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated. Lord Arian, still holding the journal, looked from Elric to the hidden chamber, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. "Father, don't listen to him," Lyra cried, her voice desperate. He's trying to deceive you. Read the journal. See the truth for yourself. Lord Arion hesitated, his gaze flickering between his daughter and Elric. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with uncertainty. Catherine knew she had to act, and fast. She couldn't let Elric reach her, couldn't let him silence her. She stepped out of the hidden chamber, her head held high, her eyes fixed on Lord Arion. "My lord," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out in the sudden silence. "I am Catherine of Dunmere, and I am here to tell you the truth." She walked towards Lord Arion, ignoring the guards who moved to intercept her. She stopped before him, her gaze unwavering. "Elric murdered my father," she said. "He plotted with your enemies, conspired to overthrow the king. He has deceived you, manipulated you, used you for his own ambitions." She held out her hand, her palm open.
"The journal is proof," she said.
"Read it, my lord. See the truth for yourself." Lord Arion looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the pain, the grief, the unwavering determination in her face. He saw the truth. He took a step back, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. But he didn't draw it. Instead, he looked at Elric, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. "Is this true, Elric?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Elric, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room, knew he was cornered. He had lost. "It's a lie," he shouted, his voice desperate. "She's lying. They're all lying." He drew his sword, his hand trembling. "I will not be betrayed," he roared. "I will not be defeated." He lunged towards Lord Arion, his sword raised to strike. But before he could reach him, a figure stepped in front of him, blocking his attack. Tristan. He had somehow escaped his captors, his face bruised and battered, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. He parried Elric's blow, his own sword meeting Elric's with a clang of steel. The two men fought, their swords flashing in the torchlight, their movements a blur of speed and skill. The room was filled with the sounds of clashing steel, the grunts of exertion, the gasps of the onlookers. Catherine watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that Tristan was fighting not just for his own life, but for hers, for Dunmere, for the future of the kingdom. He was wounded, weakened, but his spirit was unbroken. He fought with a courage and a determination that Catherine had never seen before. He parried, thrust, dodged, his movements precise and deadly. He forced Elric back, step by step, his sword a whirlwind of steel. Finally, with a swift, decisive move, Tristan disarmed Elric, sending his sword clattering to the floor. He stood over him, his sword pointed at Elric's throat. "It's over, Elric," Tristan said, his voice cold and hard. "Your treachery ends here." Elric looked up at him, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat. He knew he was finished. Lord Arion stepped forward, his face grim. "Guards," he said, his voice commanding. "Seize him." The guards moved forward, surrounding Elric, their swords drawn. They took him into custody, his struggles futile. Lord Arion turned to Tristan, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and respect. "You have saved my life, Sir Tristan," he said, "and you have exposed a traitor. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Tristan lowered his sword, his body exhausted, but his spirit soaring. "I did what was right, my lord," he said. "That is all that matters." Lord Arion turned to Catherine, his gaze softening. "Lady Catherine," he said,
"I apologize
"for doubting you, for believing Elric's lies. I have wronged you and your family." Catherine met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and forgiveness. "All is forgiven, my lord. So long as justice is served." The abyss had been averted, barely. But the scars, she knew, would take a very, very long time to heal. Elric's betrayal had cut deep and far. Chapter 13. Letters of Fire and Ice. The aftermath of Elric's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. Lord Arion, shaken by the revelation of the conspiracy and his own near-fatal misjudgment, took swift action. He sent riders to the king, carrying Elric's journal and a full account of the events at Silverwood. He dispatched troops to secure Dunmere, ensuring its protection from any remaining loyalists to Elric. And he ordered a full investigation into the conspiracy, determined to root out any other traitors who might be lurking in the shadows. Catherine and Tristan were hailed as heroes, their bravery and determination lauded by all. Lord Arion, deeply remorseful for his earlier suspicions, offered them his full support, promising to aid them in reclaiming Dunmere and restoring its rightful place. But despite the public acclaim and the promise of justice, Catherine found herself struggling with a profound sense of unease. The events of the past few weeks had taken a heavy toll, leaving her emotionally and physically exhausted. She had faced betrayal, danger, and the constant threat of death. She had seen the dark side of human nature, the depths of treachery and deceit. She found it difficult to reconcile the image of Tristan as a traitor with the man she had come to know, the man who had risked everything to help her, the man who had fought so bravely to defend her and expose Elric's lies. She was grateful for his actions, admired his courage, and felt a growing connection to him, a bond forged in shared adversity. But a part of her still held back, wary of trusting too easily, scarred by the past. Tristan, too, seemed to be struggling. He was quieter than usual, his face often clouded with a mixture of sadness and regret. He carried the weight of his father's oath, the burden of his forced service to Elric, the guilt of his perceived betrayal. He had cleared his name, proven his loyalty, but the scars of the past remained. One evening, as they were sitting together in a quiet corner of Silverwood's library, Catherine found a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to her father, Lord Alaric, in a familiar handwriting. "These are from my mother," Tristan said, his voice soft, noticing her discovery. "She wrote to your father often. They were close friends." Catherine looked at the letters, her curiosity piqued. She untied the ribbon and carefully opened one of the letters. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages. The letters were filled with warmth, affection, and a deep sense of shared understanding. They spoke of family, of politics, of the challenges of ruling, of the joys and sorrows of life. As she read, Catherine began to see a different side of her father, a side she had never known. She saw him not just as a strong and just ruler, but as a man who valued friendship, who cherished the counsel of a wise and compassionate woman. She also saw a different side of Tristan's mother, a woman of intelligence, strength, and unwavering loyalty. A woman who had faced her own share of hardships, but who had never lost her faith, her hope, her belief in the power of good. As she continued to read, she came across a letter that made her heart skip a beat. It was written shortly after Tristan's birth, and it spoke of a promise, a pact made between Tristan's mother and her father. "I have named him Tristan," the letter read, "in honor of your own strength and courage. And I pray that one day he will be as loyal and true a friend to your Catherine as you have been to me. Perhaps, if the fates are kind, they may even find a deeper connection, a bond that will unite our families for generations to come." Catherine stared at the letter, her mind reeling. A pact. A promise. A hope for a future that had been shattered by betrayal and death. She looked at Tristan, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She saw the weight of his family's history, the burden of expectations, the conflict between duty and desire. "I never knew," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tristan nodded, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It was a secret," he said, "a hope that was never realized. Until now." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "Catherine," he said, his voice hesitant, "I know I have betrayed your trust in the past. I know I have caused you pain, but I hope that, in time, you can forgive me. I hope that, perhaps we can start anew." Catherine met his gaze, her heart filled with a confusing mix of emotions. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse, the flicker of hope. She saw the man he truly was, the man beneath the scars, the man who had risked everything to help her. She did not reply, but, reaching out, took his hand. It was a start. It would have to be enough for now. A fragile beginning, forged in fire and ice. Chapter 14. The Prisoner of Conscience. The return to Dunmere was a bittersweet homecoming. Catherine, riding alongside Tristan and a contingent of Lord Arian's knights, felt a surge of emotion as she saw the familiar walls of her ancestral home rising in the distance. It was a place of both joy and sorrow, of cherished memories and painful losses. The castle was eerily quiet, its usual bustling activity replaced by an air of apprehension. The servants, their faces etched with worry, greeted Catherine with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had lived under Auric's rule for months, enduring his harsh decrees and the constant threat of his men. They were unsure of what the future held, uncertain of their place in this new order. Catherine, with Tristan by her side, reassured them, promising to restore Dunmere to its former glory, to ensure their safety and well-being. She spoke of justice, of healing, of a new beginning. But her words, though heartfelt, felt hollow even to her own ears. The scars of the past were still too fresh, the wounds too deep. Auric's men had been rounded up and imprisoned, awaiting the king's judgment. Catherine ordered them to be treated fairly, with dignity and respect, despite their allegiance to a traitor. She would not stoop to Auric's level of cruelty, would not allow vengeance to consume her. She found Thomas in the great hall, sitting alone on the throne that had once belonged to their father. He looked pale and shaken, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. He had been a puppet, a tool in Auric's hands, too young and inexperienced to resist. Catherine embraced him, offering him comfort and forgiveness. She knew he had not been a willing participant in Auric's treachery, that he had been as much a victim as she had been. "It's all right, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle. "It's over now. We're safe. We're home." But even as she spoke those words, she knew that home would never be the same. The shadow of Auric's betrayal, the memory of her father's murder, would forever linger in the halls of Dunmere. She spent the following days overseeing the restoration of order, working tirelessly to repair the damage Auric had done. She reinstated the old laws, dismissed Auric's corrupt officials, and appointed new ones, choosing men and women she knew she could trust. She also spent time with Tristan, their relationship evolving into a tentative friendship, a fragile bond built on shared adversity and a growing mutual respect. They spoke of the future, of their hopes and plans for Dunmere, of their desire to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. But despite their efforts, a sense of unease persisted. Catherine found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting to see Auric's shadow, expecting another betrayal, another attack. She couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was not yet over, that there were still secrets to be uncovered, wounds to be healed. One day, as she was walking through the castle gardens, she came across a small, secluded chapel, the same chapel where she had met Tristan that fateful night, where they had discovered Auric's hidden chamber. She entered the chapel, its familiar scent of incense and old stone offering a small measure of comfort. She knelt before the altar, her heart heavy, her mind troubled. She prayed for guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to make the right decisions, to lead her people, to protect her home. She prayed for forgiveness, for herself and for others, for the sins of the past, for the pain and suffering that had been inflicted. As she prayed, she heard a sound behind her, a soft footstep, a rustle of clothing. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Tristan. He stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. I saw you come in," he said, his voice hesitant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No," Catherine said, her voice soft. "You're not disturbing me."
Come in.
He entered the chapel, his steps slow and deliberate. He knelt beside her, his gaze fixed on the altar. I often come here," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
To pray.
"To remember." "To remember what?" Catherine asked, her voice curious. He hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep pain. "To remember my father," he said. "To remember his oath. To remember my failure. Catherine felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew the weight of his burden, the guilt he carried, the shame he felt. It wasn't your fault, Tristan, she said, her voice gentle. You were bound by an oath. You did what you thought was right. He shook his head. I should have known better, he said. I should have seen through Elric's lies. I should have protected your father. You couldn't have known, Catherine said. No one could have known. Elric was a master of deception. But I stood beside him, Tristan said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I watched him, I did nothing. Catherine reached out and touched his hand, her fingers interlacing with his.
You did what you could, she said.
And you risked everything to help me, to expose him. You saved me, Tristan. You saved Dunmere. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said. You have it, Catherine said, her voice sincere. You have earned it. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He was a prisoner, not of stone walls, but of his own conscience. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise of support, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain, their shared hope for a better future. They would need time, but perhaps, eventually, healing would truly come. Chapter 15. Echoes of the Fallen. The king's justice was swift and decisive. Elric, stripped of his titles and lands, was sentenced to life imprisonment in the deepest dungeons of the royal castle. His co-conspirators, those who had been implicated in his plot to overthrow the throne, were similarly punished, their fates ranging from imprisonment to exile. Catherine, though relieved that justice had been served, found little solace in Elric's punishment. His imprisonment did not bring back her father, did not erase the pain and suffering he had caused. It was a necessary consequence, a step towards healing, but it was not a cure. She returned to Dunmere, determined to rebuild, to restore her home to its former glory. She worked tirelessly, overseeing the repairs to the castle, the revitalization of the lands, the welfare of her people. She was a strong and capable leader, her determination fueled by a fierce love for her home and a deep sense of responsibility to her people. But beneath her strong exterior, she carried a profound sense of loss, a grief that lingered like a shadow, darkening her days and haunting her nights. She missed her father terribly, his wise counsel, his comforting presence, his unwavering love. She also found herself thinking often of Tristan. He had remained at Dunmere, offering his support, his expertise, his companionship. He was a constant presence, a steady hand in a turbulent sea. He understood her grief, her pain, her determination to rebuild. He had shared her journey, faced the same dangers, borne the same burdens. Their relationship had evolved, shifting from a tentative friendship to something deeper, something more complex. There was a connection between them, a bond forged in shared adversity, a mutual respect and admiration that had blossomed into something more. But neither of them dared to speak of it, to acknowledge the unspoken feelings that simmered beneath the surface. One day, as Catherine was working in the castle library, sorting through old documents and scrolls, she came across a hidden compartment in one of the bookshelves. It was a small, secret space, concealed behind a panel of intricately carved wood. She opened the compartment, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to her father, in a handwriting she did not recognize. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages. The letters were from a woman named Isolde, a woman who had clearly been close to her father. They spoke of love, of loss, of a secret that had been kept hidden for many years. As she read, Catherine began to piece together a story, a tragic tale of forbidden love, of betrayal, of a child born out of wedlock. A child who had been hidden away, protected from the scandal, raised in secrecy. She realized, with a growing sense of shock and disbelief, that the child was her. She was not Lord Alaric's legitimate daughter. She was the product of a forbidden love affair, a secret that had been kept hidden for her entire life. She felt a wave of nausea, a sense of disorientation. Her entire world, Her identity, her understanding of her past, had been shattered. She didn't know who she was anymore. She stumbled out of the library, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Tristan in the courtyard, practicing his swordsmanship. She approached him, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and fear. "Tristan," she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you. I've discovered something terrible." He stopped his practice, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it, Catherine?" he asked. "What's wrong?" She held out the letters, her hands shaking. "Read these," she said. They explain everything." He took the letters, his brow furrowed in confusion. He began to read, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression growing darker with each passing line. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and compassion. "Catherine," he said, his voice soft. I don't know what to say." "It's true, isn't it?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm not who I thought I was." He nodded slowly. "It seems so," he said. "But it doesn't change who you are, Catherine. You are still the same person. You are still strong, capable, compassionate. You are still you." "But my father," she said, her voice breaking. "He lied to me. He kept this secret from me my entire life." "He did it to protect you," Tristan said. "He loved you, Catherine, more than anything." "But who am I?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Who is my real father?" Tristan hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "The letters, they don't say," he said. "But there is a name mentioned. Isolde's brother. A man named Gareth." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Gareth. The name meant nothing to her. "I need to find him," she said, her voice filled with a sudden, desperate need. "I need to know the truth. I need to know who I am." The echoes of the fallen, of her mother, of her true father, of the man she'd loved as a father, all swirled. She needed answers, and she would not rest until she found them. She had to uncover the final, hidden truth. Chapter 16. The King's Decree. The quest to uncover her true parentage consumed Catherine. The name Gareth, mentioned only briefly in Isolde's letters, became a beacon, a guiding star in the darkness of her uncertainty. She spent hours poring over old records, searching for any mention of him, any clue that might lead her to his identity, his whereabouts. Tristan, ever supportive, assisted her in her search, his knowledge of noble families and their histories proving invaluable. He also provided a steadying presence, a calming influence in the midst of her emotional turmoil. He understood her need to know the truth, her desire to understand her past, her longing to connect with her lost heritage. Their search led them to the Royal Archives, a vast repository of documents and records stretching back centuries. They spent days sifting through dusty tomes and crumbling scrolls, their eyes scanning countless names, their hopes rising and falling with each new discovery. Finally, they found a reference to a Gareth of Lyonesse, a minor lord who had served in the royal court many years ago. He had been known for his skill as a warrior, his loyalty to the king, and his close friendship with Isolde. Catherine felt a surge of excitement, a flicker of hope. Could this be him? Could this be her father? They discovered that Gareth of Lyonesse had disappeared from the court shortly after Isolde's death, his fate unknown. Some rumors suggested he had been killed in battle, others that he had gone into exile, seeking refuge in a distant land. Catherine, determined to find the truth, decided to travel to Lyonesse, Gareth's ancestral home, hoping to find some trace of him, some clue that might lead her to his final resting place, or perhaps even to him if he were still alive. Tristan, ever loyal, insisted on accompanying her, his presence a source of comfort and strength. He knew the journey would be dangerous, that there were still those who might seek to harm Catherine, to exploit her vulnerability. Before they could depart, however, a royal messenger arrived at Dunmere, carrying a decree from the king. The king, having learned of Catherine's true parentage and of her efforts to expose Elric's treachery, had issued a formal proclamation, recognizing her as the rightful heir to Dunmere, granting her the title of Lady of Dunmere in her own right, regardless of her birth. The decree was a public affirmation of her legitimacy, a vindication of her claims, a recognition of her strength and courage. It was a moment of triumph, a victory over the shadows of the past. Catherine, though grateful for the king's support, felt a sense of detachment, a feeling that the title, the lands, the recognition were meaningless without the truth of her origins. She was determined to continue her search, to find Gareth, to understand her past, to finally know who she truly was. She informed the king of her intentions, requesting his permission to travel to Lyonesse. The king, understanding her need, granted her his blessing, offering his support and protection. And so, Catherine and Tristan, accompanied by a small retinue of trusted guards, set out on their journey to Lyonesse, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were embarking on a quest for truth, a journey into the unknown, a search for a lost father, a forgotten past. The journey was long and arduous, taking them through rugged mountains and dense forests, across vast plains and treacherous rivers. They faced dangers both seen and unseen, from bandits and wild animals to the lingering threat of Elric's loyalists. But through it all, Catherine and Tristan remained steadfast, their determination unwavering, their bond strengthening with each passing day. They shared their hopes and fears, their dreams and regrets, their growing feelings for each other. They spoke of the future, of what they might find in Lyonesse, of what they would do if they discovered Gareth was still alive. They spoke of their love for Dunmere, of their desire to rebuild, to create a better future for their people. And, slowly, tentatively, they began to speak of their feelings for each other. They acknowledged the unspoken connection, the bond that had grown between them, the spark of something deeper, something more than friendship. But they also acknowledged the obstacles, the uncertainties, the shadows of the past that still lingered between them. They knew that their journey was far from over, that there were still challenges to face, secrets to uncover, wounds to heal. As they neared Lyonesse, the landscape changed, becoming wilder, more desolate. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, the sky a vast expanse of gray. It was a land of ancient legends, of forgotten battles, of hidden secrets. It was a land that mirrored Catherine's own inner turmoil, her own quest for truth, her own search for her lost identity. The journey had, she felt, truly only just begun. Chapter 17. A Web of Lies. Lyonesse was a stark contrast to the rolling hills and fertile valleys of Dunmere. The land was rugged and windswept, its rocky coastline battered by the relentless sea. The castle of Lyonesse, perched high on a cliff overlooking the ocean, was a formidable fortress, its gray stone walls seeming to grow out of the very rock itself. It was a place of ancient power, of hidden secrets, of a past shrouded in mist and legend. Catherine and Tristan, arriving at the castle gates, were greeted with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The current lord of Lyonesse, a distant cousin of Gareth, was a cautious and wary man, his loyalty to the king unwavering, but his trust hard-won. Catherine, presenting the king's decree and explaining her quest, was granted an audience with Lord Rhys, a man whose age was etched deeply into his face, but whose eyes still held a sharp, assessing intelligence. Lord Rhys listened to her story with a mixture of skepticism and something else. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a hint of suppressed knowledge. Gareth of Lyonesse, he said, his voice raspy with age. That name has not been spoken here in many years. He was a troubled man. A warrior, yes, but reckless. Impulsive. He was my father, Catherine said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of emotion she felt. I need to know what happened to him. Lord Rhys hesitated, his gaze shifting to Tristan, then back to Catherine. The official record, he said, states that he died in battle, fighting against a band of raiders. His body was never recovered. Catherine felt a pang of disappointment, a sense of loss. But she also sensed that Lord Rhys was not telling her the whole truth. There was something he was holding back, some secret he was guarding. I don't believe you, she said, her voice challenging. I believe there is more to the story. I believe you know what happened to him. Lord Reese sighed, his shoulders slumping. Very well, he said. You are persistent, I will give you that. But the truth, it is not a pleasant tale. He led them to a small, secluded chamber, high in one of the castle towers. It was a room filled with old books and scrolls, a place where the past seemed to linger in the air. Gareth was involved with Isolde, Lord Reese said, his voice low, almost a whisper. It was a forbidden love, a dangerous liaison. She was betrothed to another, a powerful lord. My father, Lord Alaric, Catherine said, her voice barely audible. Lord Reese nodded. When Isolde became pregnant, he continued, Gareth was forced to flee. He was accused of treason, of seducing a noblewoman, of threatening the peace of the realm. But he didn't betray her, Catherine said. He loved her. And he loved me. Perhaps, Lord Reese said. But love, it can be a dangerous thing. It can lead to betrayal, to heartbreak, to ruin. He paused, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as if looking back into the past. Gareth did not die in battle, he said. He was captured. Imprisoned. By order of Lord Alaric. Catherine felt a cold hand grip her heart. Her father. The man she had loved and admired. The man she had believed to be honorable and just. He had imprisoned her real father, condemned him to a life of suffering. Where? She asked, her voice trembling. Where is he imprisoned? Lord Reese hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning.
He is here, he said.
In Lyonesse. In the dungeons beneath this very castle. Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Her father alive? Imprisoned for all these years, just a few feet beneath her? Take me to him, she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. I need to see him. I need to know the truth. Lord Reese nodded slowly. Very well, he said. But be warned, Lady Catherine. The truth, it can be a heavy burden to bear. He led them down a winding staircase, deep into the bowels of the castle. The air grew colder, damper, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the echo of their footsteps. They reached a heavy, iron-bound door, guarded by two grim-faced men. Lord Reese spoke to the guards, and they nodded, unlocking the door and swinging it open. The dungeons of Lyonesse were a dark and forbidding place, a labyrinth of narrow corridors and dank cells. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of despair, of lost hope. Lord Reese led them through the maze of passageways, his lantern casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. They passed cells filled with prisoners, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. Finally, they reached a small, isolated cell at the very end of a long corridor. Lord Reese stopped before the door, his hand trembling as he held up the lantern. He is in there, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Gareth of Lyonesse. Your father. Catherine felt a wave of emotion, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and a strange, unfamiliar sense of hope. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for the door. This was it. The truth. But Lord Reese's hand on her arm stopped her. Be warned, he repeated. He may not be the man you expect. She looked into his eyes, seeing the unspoken warning. But it was too late. She had to know. Chapter 18. The Heart's Awakening. Catherine pushed open the heavy cell door, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound that echoed the turmoil within her own heart. The lantern light spilled into the small, dank space, revealing a figure huddled in the corner, a man who was a shadow of his former self. He was old, his hair white and matted, his face gaunt and lined, his body thin and frail. He was dressed in rags, his chains rattling as he slowly raised his head, his eyes squinting in the sudden light. Who is it? He asked, his voice raspy and weak, a mere whisper of sound. Catherine stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. It is I, she said, her voice trembling. Catherine, your daughter. The man stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief. He blinked several times, as if trying to clear his vision, to make sense of what he was seeing. Catherine? he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and doubt. Is it truly you? Catherine knelt before him, her eyes searching his face, looking for some sign of recognition, some flicker of the father she had never known. Yes, she said, her voice choked with emotion. It is I. I have come to find you, to learn the truth. Tears welled up in the old man's eyes, tracing paths down his weathered cheeks. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against her face. My daughter, he whispered, his voice filled with a profound sadness. My beautiful daughter. I never thought I would see you again. Catherine took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His touch was weak, frail, but it sent a jolt of emotion through her, a connection to a past she had never known, a bond with a father she had only just found. I am here, Father, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of grief and a strange, unfamiliar sense of joy. I am here. They spent the next few hours together, talking, sharing their stories, piecing together the fragments of their shattered lives. Gareth told her of his love for Isolde, of their forbidden romance, of his joy at her birth, of his pain at being separated from them. He told her of his imprisonment, of the years of darkness and despair, of the constant threat of death, of the fading hope that he would ever be free again. Catherine listened, her heart aching for him, for the injustice he had suffered, for the life that had been stolen from him. She told him of her own life, of her upbringing at Dunmere, of her love for the father she had known, of her quest to uncover the truth, of her journey to find him. As they talked, Catherine began to see the man beneath the scars, the warrior beneath the prisoner, the father beneath the broken shell. She saw the strength, the courage, the unwavering love that had sustained him through all these years. She also saw the toll that imprisonment had taken, the damage that had been done, the wounds that might never fully heal. He was a shadow of his former self, a broken man, his spirit crushed by years of suffering. As the hours passed, a new feeling began to stir within Catherine, a feeling that had been slowly growing, tentatively blossoming, during their journey to Lyonesse. It was a feeling she had tried to suppress, to deny, to ignore, but it could no longer be contained. She looked at Tristan, who had been standing silently by, watching them, listening to their conversation, his eyes filled with compassion and something more. She saw the strength, the loyalty, the unwavering support he had given her, the risks he had taken, the sacrifices he had made. She saw the man he truly was, the man beneath the armor, the man who had captured her heart. She realized, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that she loved him. Not just as a friend, not just as a companion, but as a woman loves a man, with a depth and intensity that she had never felt before. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. He looked at her, his eyes questioning, his gaze searching hers. Tristan, she said, her voice soft but clear. I love you. He stared at her, his eyes widening in surprise. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I know it's unexpected, Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. And perhaps inappropriate, given the circumstances. But I cannot deny it any longer. I love you, Tristan. With all my heart. A slow smile spread across Tristan's face, his eyes lighting up with a joy that mirrored her own. He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze holding hers. Catherine, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I love you too. I have loved you for a long time, but I never dared to hope. He leaned forward and kissed her, a tender, gentle kiss that sealed their love, a promise of a future together, a future built on trust, on respect, on a bond that had been forged in the fires of adversity. Gareth, watching them, smiled, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. It seems, he whispered, his voice filled with a bittersweet joy, that some good has come from all this pain. Some light has emerged from the darkness. It was a moment of profound happiness, a moment of healing, a moment of hope. A new chapter was beginning, a new love was blossoming, a new future was unfolding. But it was also tinged with sadness. Gareth's freedom, their future, all remained uncertain. Chapter 19. Storm over Stonebridge. The reunion with Gareth, while emotionally profound, presented a new set of challenges. He was a broken man, both physically and mentally, his years of imprisonment having taken a heavy toll. Catherine, with Tristan's unwavering support, was determined to secure his release and provide him with the care he desperately needed. Lord Rhys, initially hesitant, was ultimately swayed by Catherine's pleas and by the undeniable evidence of Gareth's innocence, revealed in Isolde's letters and Elric's own journal. He agreed to petition the king for Gareth's pardon, but warned that the process could take time and that the king's decision was far from certain. While they awaited the king's response, Catherine and Tristan focused on making Gareth as comfortable as possible. They moved him from the dungeons to a small, but comfortable chamber within the castle, providing him with warm clothing, nourishing food, and the constant companionship he had been denied for so long. Tristan, with his experience in healing and his natural empathy, took on the role of Gareth's primary caregiver. He tended to his wounds, both physical and emotional, offering him comfort, reassurance, and a steadying presence. Catherine, meanwhile, spent hours with Gareth, listening to his stories, learning about his past, and slowly, tentatively, building a relationship with the father she had never known. It was a delicate process, filled with moments of joy and sorrow, of connection and distance. Gareth was often withdrawn, lost in his memories, haunted by the ghosts of his past. But there were also moments of clarity, of lucidity, when his eyes would sparkle with a flicker of his former spirit, when he would speak of Isolde with a love that had endured through all the years of darkness. During this time, Catherine and Tristan's love for each other deepened, their bond strengthening with each passing day. They found solace in each other's arms, comfort in each other's presence, hope in each other's love. They spoke of the future, of their plans for Dunmere, of their desire to build a life together, a life filled with love, with justice, with peace. But their happiness was shadowed by the uncertainty of Gareth's fate and by the looming threat of those who might still seek to harm them. Elric, though imprisoned, still had loyalists, men who might seek revenge, who might try to undermine Catherine's rule, who might even attempt to free their former master. One evening, as a fierce storm raged outside, battering the walls of Lyonesse Castle, a messenger arrived, carrying urgent news from Dunmere. Thomas, acting as regent in Catherine's absence, had received reports of a growing unrest in the southern region of their lands, near the border with Stonebridge, a neighboring territory ruled by Lord Marius, a known associate of Elric. The reports spoke of armed men gathering, of whispered rumors of rebellion, of a plot to overthrow Catherine's rule and restore Dunmere to Elric's control. Catherine, alarmed by the news, knew she had to act quickly. She could not allow Dunmere to fall back into the hands of her enemies. She had to return home, to protect her people, to defend her lands. Tristan, ever loyal, insisted on accompanying her, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. Gareth, though frail, also expressed a desire to return to Dunmere, to see the home of his beloved Isolde, to perhaps find some measure of peace in the land where she had lived and died. Lord Rhys, concerned for their safety, offered them an escort of his own men, a contingent of seasoned warriors who would protect them on their journey. And so, under the cover of the storm, Catherine, Tristan, Gareth, and a small band of loyal knights set out from Lyonesse, their hearts filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination. They were riding into danger, facing an unknown threat, but they were united in their purpose, their love for each other, their loyalty to Dunmere. The storm raged around them, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing down, the lightning illuminating the sky with flashes of blinding light. It was a fitting backdrop for their perilous journey, a reflection of the turmoil within their hearts, the uncertainty of their future. As they rode, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. She had a premonition, a sense of impending danger, a feeling that the storm was not just a natural phenomenon, but a harbinger of something far more sinister. She was right. As they neared Stonebridge, they were ambushed. A band of armed men, their faces hidden behind masks, emerged from the darkness, their swords drawn, their intentions clear. The battle was swift and brutal. Catherine and Tristan, fighting side by side, defended themselves and Gareth with courage and skill. But they were outnumbered, surrounded by enemies, their situation desperate. The storm mirrored the chaos of the battle, the thunder echoing the clash of steel, the lightning illuminating the faces of their attackers, their eyes filled with hatred and bloodlust. It was a fight for survival, a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. They were losing, and Catherine knew, with chilling certainty, that this had been the plan all along. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The ambush was a carefully orchestrated trap. Lord Marius of Stonebridge, a long-time ally of Elric, had been waiting for them, his men hidden among the rocks and trees, their swords sharpened, their hatred fueled by promises of power and reward. Catherine and Tristan fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, their swords a blur of motion, their bodies moving with a practiced grace honed by years of training. They protected Gareth, shielding him from the attackers, their own safety secondary to his survival. But they were outnumbered, their strength waning, their defenses crumbling. Tristan took a blow to the shoulder, his arm going numb, his sword slipping from his grasp. Catherine, seeing him fall, cried out in alarm, her heart filled with a fear she had never known before. She fought with renewed fury, her sword a whirlwind of steel, driving back the attackers who pressed in on Tristan. But there were too many of them, their numbers relentless, their attacks unceasing. She saw one of them raise his sword to strike Tristan, a killing blow aimed at his unprotected head. She knew she couldn't reach him in time, couldn't save him. Suddenly, a figure stepped in front of Tristan, shielding him from the blow.
Gareth.
He had armed himself with a discarded sword, his frail body trembling, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. The blow struck him, the sword piercing his chest, his body crumpling to the ground. Catherine screamed, her voice a raw, anguished cry that echoed through the storm. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the bleeding. But it was too late. The wound was mortal. Gareth looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and peace. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice weak, barely audible above the roar of the storm. "My daughter, I am glad I saw you again." His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Then his hand fell limp, his eyes closing, his body still. He was gone. Catherine wept, her tears mingling with the rain that lashed down upon them. She had found her father, only to lose him again, so soon, so tragically. Tristan, his arm wounded, but his spirit unbroken, knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to comfort her. He, too, was grieving, his eyes filled with sorrow and rage. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here. We have to get to safety." Catherine, numb with grief, allowed him to help her to her feet. They had to escape, to survive, to honor Gareth's sacrifice. They fought their way through the remaining attackers, their movements fueled by a desperate need for survival. They managed to reach their horses, mounting them and fleeing into the storm, leaving behind the carnage, the bodies, the shattered remnants of their hopes. They rode for hours, the storm their only companion, their grief their only burden. They finally reached a small, abandoned village, seeking shelter in a ruined church, its roof partially collapsed, its walls crumbling. They huddled together for warmth, their bodies exhausted, their spirits broken. Catherine wept, her tears flowing unchecked, her grief overwhelming. Tristan held her close, offering her comfort, his own pain masked by his need to protect her, to support her. "He saved you," Catherine whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He sacrificed himself for you." Tristan nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "He was a brave man," he said. "A good man. I wish I had known him better." They sat in silence for a long time, their grief a shared burden, their love a fragile flame in the darkness. As the storm began to subside, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds, Catherine made a decision. She would not be defeated. She would not let Gareth's sacrifice be in vain. She would return to Dunmere. She would rally her people. She would fight for her home, for her future, for the memory of her father. "We need to go back," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of emotion that still lingered.
"We need to fight.
"We need to win." Tristan nodded, his eyes filled with admiration and love. "I am with you, Catherine," he said. "Always." They left the ruined church, their faces grim, their hearts heavy, but their determination renewed. They were riding back into danger, facing an uncertain future, but they were together. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness, their duty a guiding star in the storm. The reckoning was at hand, not just of battles to be fought, but of feelings, long denied, now acknowledged, now impossible to turn away from. Epilogue. The final confrontation at Dunmere was not the grand, sweeping battle Catherine had envisioned. It was a series of skirmishes, of strategic maneuvers, of rallying loyal forces, and exposing traitors within the ranks. Lord Marius, lacking Alric's cunning and charisma, proved a less formidable opponent. His forces, demoralized by Alric's imprisonment and lacking strong leadership, were quickly routed. Catherine, riding at the head of her troops, displayed a courage and a tactical acumen that surprised even Tristan. She was not just a grieving daughter or a reluctant ruler, she was a warrior, a leader, a queen in all but name. She inspired her people, rallying them to her cause, uniting them against a common enemy. Marius was captured, his rebellion crushed, his dreams of power shattered. He was sent to the king, to face the same justice that had been meted out to Elric. With Dunmere secure, Catherine turned her attention to rebuilding, to healing, to creating a future worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. She ruled with wisdom and compassion, guided by the memory of her two fathers, Alaric, the man who had raised her, and Gareth, the man who had given her life. She implemented reforms, ensuring justice and fairness for all her people. She strengthened the defenses of Dunmere, preparing for any future threats. And she fostered a sense of unity, of community, of shared purpose. Tristan, ever at her side, served as her most trusted advisor, her confidant, her partner in all things. He was her strength, her support, her unwavering love. He helped her navigate the complexities of court politics, the challenges of leadership, the lingering grief that still haunted her. They were married in the spring, a simple ceremony held in the castle chapel, attended by the people of Dunmere, by Lord Arian and Lady Lyra, by the ghosts of those they had lost. It was a celebration of love, of hope, of a new beginning. Catherine, wearing a simple gown of white silk, her hair adorned with wildflowers, looked radiant. Tristan, standing beside her, his eyes filled with love and admiration, looked every inch the noble knight, the honorable man he truly was. They exchanged vows, their voices clear and strong, their promises echoing through the chapel. They pledged their love, their loyalty, their lives to each other, their bond unbreakable, their future intertwined. Years passed, and Dunmere prospered under Catherine's wise and just rule. She and Tristan had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' strength, their courage, their love for their home. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the pain and suffering they had endured, but they had also learned valuable lessons. They had learned the importance of trust, of loyalty, of forgiveness. They had learned the power of love, of hope, of resilience. Catherine never forgot her father, Gareth. She had a small memorial built in the castle gardens, a place where she could go to remember him, to honor his sacrifice, to feel connected to the man she had only known for a brief, precious time. She and Tristan often visited the memorial together, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They would speak of Gareth, of Isolde, of the love that had brought them together, of the legacy they had left behind. And as they looked out over the rolling hills of Dunmere, the castle standing tall and proud against the sky, they knew that they had built something beautiful, something enduring, something worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. They had created a home, a family, a future filled with love, with hope, with peace. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale ending, but in the quiet strength of their enduring love, in the steady rhythm of their shared lives, in the enduring legacy of Dunmere, their home, their sanctuary, their forever.